Should we maximize pleasure? Wait, that's hedonism. Should we maximize happiness? That almost sounds like the same thing. Should we maximize happiness for the greatest number? Okay, now we've moved into John Stuart Mill's territory. So we began with something like hedonism, which is very easy. Even in the ancient world, we saw people talking about this. Then we moved to Jeremy Bentham, who advocated for a utilitarianism which maximizes happiness. And then finally, John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill said, no, we need to consider other people. And so we have to consider the extent of our actions and how it is that they affect others. Well, why in the world would people be entertaining this at this time? What was special about the late 18th century and then early 19th century, where people were talking about utilitarianism in a way that really hadn't been in the philosophical theological dialogue for a couple thousand years? And the answer to this is relatively straightforward. The question of whether or not we can actually produce a science of ethics followed from us having success producing a science of a lot of other things. But that's not the full story either. The success that we had in producing a science of a number of other things was itself a result of some of the changes that had happened historically. And so what we see is the medieval world didn't do this, and the medieval world didn't develop Newtonian physics because they were still very much concerned with Aristotelian physics. They were concerned with Christianity's ethics, and so there was no reason not to base something upon God. But with the cry of the Protestant Reformation and the kind of fall of the Catholic Church's hegemony with respect to not only political life, but also intellectual life, and then the crumbling of the European states, we saw a time where people were trying to pick up the pieces and reconstruct everything. And the thought is, well, okay, if we can no longer assume God, then what are we going to do? Descartes first said, okay, well, let's try and reconstruct this from the ground up and save speculative philosophy so that, scholasticism could be somewhat vindicated and we could actually get God back and everything would be okay. But even though he thought this worked, history doesn't tend to agree with Descartes. And so a lot of people, even who were professed Cartesians after that point, like a Thomas Hobbes, they didn't really follow along with that conclusion either. And so it seems as though the conclusion that Descartes wanted to draw didn't quite work. Well, okay, so if God isn't going to be in the picture and we have to try and do something in philosophy, what are we going to do? How are we going to structure inquiry? How are we going to structure society? And then how are we going to think about what morality should be? Well, how we should structure inquiry is a question that Francis Bacon answered, and then Newton would put an exclamation point on with his calculus, with Leibniz's calculus, and then the physics. So we had that. The social contract from Hobbes, as discussed from Hobbes all the way through Rousseau and beyond, was the way that people were trying to address, okay, what should politics be? If we can no longer assume that the king has a divine right to be there, we're going to have to look for something else. Let's see if we can reconstruct things via reason, because they still seem to think very highly of reason. And with all of these things falling in line, it stood to reason then that ethics, that we should try and at least construct a science of ethics. And maybe there was some possibility for deriving from reason some kind of ethical principles and trying to figure out how it is that people behave, how they should behave. And this resulted in what we see with utilitarianism and then also with Kant. And so utilitarianism advocated for creating this science of ethics and trying to go, all the way with it and saying we're actually going to quantify things. And Jeremy Bentham even proposed a hedon as a unit. So this is kind of like the units that were then proposed and were new in physics, so that we could then have a unit of ethics. It was a unit of pleasure. And so a hedon, from, hedonia and pleasure, hedonism, was his way of saying, all right, let's try and create then, in the spirit of Newton and Leibniz, a calculus, a hedonic calculus of ethics. Is it possible for us to actually create a quantifiable way of assessing ethics? Now, this was partially to say, okay, for your average person, let's see if we can figure out philosophically what's going on, and then we'll, let people know what reason has determined, I suppose. But realistically, a lot of what they had in mind was with respect to the construction of societies. Remember that this is happening right around the time of the American Revolution and right around the time of the French Revolution. So all these things were, bubbling up, and people had to kind of decide what to do. So they were looking to various intellectuals to try and figure this out. Locke was very useful for the American Revolution, the American, thinking and construction of its government. And then likewise, utilitarianism was very influential in England and then also arguably in the United States as well with respect to legislation. Now, why would this be useful for legislation? Why would it make sense to try and have a quantified version of ethics and human behavior when it seems as though that is so opposed to our intuition and the way that we think about things? Well, it may be because it removes our intuition from it and it removes a lot of the subjectivity, which, of course, the removal of subjectivity was exactly the sort of thing that was at stake between about 1600 or so, easily 1630 when Descartes started publishing, and then moving up to about 1750 when Rousseau, raised his hand and said, wait a minute, we're missing something. And this is the beginning sort of existentialism where we're pointing again to, well, maybe the human experience actually does have something to offer beyond equations and numbers and objectivity. During that time, however, and this being right around the time that that sort of thought was coming into its own, we still see people trying to work out, okay, maybe we can have a science of these things. Maybe it is possible for us to have an objective way of doing this because, the subjective way of creating laws is really, subject to corruption and produces a lot of things that are not necessarily so savory. So they wanted to try to avoid some of the, political, legislative, and otherwise catastrophes that had befallen, Europe for a couple of centuries. And so it wasn't crazy. It wasn't crazy to try to do this. And it also wasn't crazy from a psychological perspective, in the sense that maybe we all weigh costs and benefits. I mean, is that something that even the animals do when they're trying to figure out what to do? Think of a story like Buridan's donkey, where you've got these two equally sized and equally appetizing bales of hay that a donkey might go up and eat. But because they are equidistant and there's absolutely nothing to tell them apart, how does the donkey choose between them? In other words, what is implicit in that story, and not the way that it's normally told, what is implicit in that story is that our motivation for something, our motivation for action must come from some kind of assessment of the situation. What looks more appetizing? What is actually going to be better for me in the long term? Now, do animals actually do a kind of calculus with this? It's hard to say. If you see a dog that's trying to figure out what to do when it's strategizing how to pursue, I don't know what it is, a cat or a toy or whatever it is, you might see something that looks an awful lot like a weighing of options. Now, I can't go all the way and say that that's actually the case. Who knows? But at the same time, with people, we're more or less conscious that this is the case. That when we're faced with a situation where the choice is not obvious, oftentimes we find ourselves, if not making a list, then at least mentally kind of going through and saying, all right, how do I feel about this? How bad is the bad? How good is the good? And am I just kind of stacking these things up and, ranking them and, sort of summing the bads and summing the goods, taking the difference, that kind of thing. And that is the simplest form of utilitarianism. Now, you might rightly raise an objection and say, but there are certain consequences that are unacceptable. In other words, there are certain things that no matter how good the goods are and how, many there are, that the consequence is so bad that we wouldn't want to do something like that. And that's the sort of, kind of guardrails based optimization that we're seeing a lot of today, where people are saying, all right, well, we're largely utilitarian within a sandbox, but if things get sufficiently bad, or sufficiently good, maybe the other side might work as well, then that modifies the calculus. Well, in other words, that just modifies the calculus. So one of the usual objections to this is something like the trolley problem. And the trolley problem, of course, is where you have, maybe one person on a train track over here, and the train is headed towards, one person on the train track over here, you have 5 people on the train track over here, and you can switch in between. And the train is headed towards the 5 people. Are you going to actually throw the lever and force it to run over the one innocent person that is on the other track? And this is something that people really struggle with. And they struggle with it insofar as especially they have direct contact with what's going on. They're actually more readily inclined to do nothing and to think themselves at least somewhat distant from the situation if they do nothing, which is one of the reasons that people don't report crimes when they see them as well. And so it's not a question so much of a, kind of weighing of costs and benefits as it is there's a strong feeling that seems to override us with certain ethical decisions that makes our ethics much more situational than we might be aware of. But at the same time, is this the death knell for utilitarianism? Maybe not. It might be the case that this is simply a modification to the problem, as I indicated before. It might be the case that this is simply inserting certain guardrails, or maybe there's another factor that we need to think of in terms of feeling. It might be the case that a certain negative feeling where I feel like I have blood on my hands by doing something is so bad that I am not willing to make what would otherwise be a rational utilitarian choice. So in other words, it simply skews the calculus in one way. And that's the curious thing, is that with all of the different examples, it seems as though the utilitarians always find a way of explaining things away and trying to figure out, well, how is it that we might, overcome this sort of thing? And so I'm thinking of Nozick's example here as well, where you're talking about a pleasure monster, and the monster is, experiences such tremendous pleasure that even a small increase in its pleasure would be, would justify the suffering of a lot of other people potentially. So it would justify a lot of other bad things happening. And, that's a peculiar thing, but at the same time, it doesn't exactly offend the utilitarian calculus. It just simply means that, well, maybe we need to make allowances for how it is that there's an asymmetry with respect to the experience of pleasure, and then account for that by adjusting things up and down in just the same way that we adjust guardrails for behavior with respect to, all kinds of different automated systems. So even that, I think, doesn't necessarily kill it. Now, the question is, are we all naturally utilitarians? And this can go one of two ways. This can mean that, Bentham and Mill can celebrate because they win no matter what it is that we might want to profess, that we all are sort of closet utilitarians. Or it might be that we're all only sort of closet utilitarians by human nature, that we, of course, weigh the benefits and costs of our actions, but it's trivially true. In the same way that, look, we have to do this, but that's not the only guiding principle. And that's just merely one of many things. And so there are several possibilities here, but at the very least, this is an idea that has appealed to people quite a bit in the last couple of centuries, and it has proven to be a very useful idea for thinking about legislation, at least insofar as it pushes us to think objectively about ethics. Because otherwise, we find ourselves, kind of putting ourselves into the situation and saying, all right, if I was there, what would I want to have happen? Or maybe I have to do this in a Rawlsian fashion and say, well, I don't know exactly what my place in society is going to be. And so if I don't know, then let me imagine myself in all of these different places and see, is there something that's just outrageous and unacceptable? The utilitarian solution is different in the sense that it attempts to completely abstract subjective experience away from the calculus, in the sense that, while we might still have pleasure and pain, I'm not in control of my pleasure. I'm not in control of my pain. And so it's the sort of thing that, while it is a subjective experience, it's not something that is subjective in terms of a kind of, assessment. Or, is that true? Is it the case that, I might report pleasure differently? Certainly. But is it possible still that we might have some more objective form of saying whether or not you enjoyed something? All right. So you see, even with that, they might have an out. So anyway, that's something to keep in mind, is that no matter how outrageous and silly the idea of quantifying ethics might sound, it's useful for legislation, and it's useful for us to think about, okay, well, costs relative to benefits of large populations, and making decisions, and I think this is key, making decisions with quantities of people that we otherwise lack the intuition for dealing with very straightforwardly. And here, what I'm thinking of is the way that we relate to different groups, different sizes of groups, based upon their different sizes and our intuitions and our faculties with respect to different sizes of groups, different, quantities of people that we're dealing with. And so if we have two people, it's very different than a social situation where we have three, which is different than a social situation if we have 8 to 10, like a graduate seminar, still very intimate, or 30 people, 25 to 30 people. Not quite as intimate, but we can still kind of have a conversation and all get to know each other, like a standard classroom. And then up to about 150, which is Dunbar's number. Beyond that, we have trouble sustaining close relationships. Well, 150, okay, kind of makes sense. It was hard for hunter-gatherer societies to be larger than 150. And so that's a kind of natural segmentation in terms of the way that human populations moved for a very long time, potentially while those instincts were forming. Who knows exactly what the story is there. But suffice to say that when I'm considering the consequences for 10,000 people, does it feel different to consider the consequences for 100,000 people? Or is it just a number? And if it's just a number, then we almost have to involve ourselves in something like this. And beyond a certain point, this is one of the things that I like to point out, is that there is a maximum in terms of the number of people that any of us have seen at any given time. And frequently that's the case where you either have like a football stadium that has 100,000 people in it, or in my case, the biggest example I think was seeing an event on the mall in Washington, D.C., so that giant grassy area in front of the Washington Monument, probably 250,000 people, but I've never seen more than that. But we regularly talk about 1,000,000 people, a city that has 10 million people, or a country that has hundreds of millions of people, or maybe even 1 billion people. But is it the case that our instincts are just simply not there for that, and we don't have any real way of relating to it? If that's true, then we might intellectually be drawn to something like utilitarianism. We might be drawn and kind of, with no other choice, have to think through it and have to reason through it using means that are not otherwise very emotional or felt to us. In other words, we land in a situation that is very much like what it is that Bentham and Mill were advocating in utilitarianism. So I hope that convinces you that there are subtle ways of thinking about this that are not just obviously right or obviously wrong. We have to kind of dig in to the psychology, to the way that this might apply to nations and cultures and whatnot. So, okay, I hope that helps. Now, let's go into a little bit more detail on what the hedonic calculus itself actually is, because they recommend a number of different qualities, and that we consider all of these things when we are making an ethical decision. So, the first is intensity. How intense is the pleasure? This is obvious. Duration. How long will it last? Well, obviously, I'm going to privilege pleasures that are longer lasting. Chocolate cake doesn't tend to have the longest lasting of pleasures, but getting a university degree does tend to have a much longer tail in terms of the goodness that it provides to you for the rest of your life. Then you have a couple of others where we're not as familiar with the words, but we're familiar with the idea. Propinquity. How soon will the pleasure occur? Is it something where I'm going to have to wait for a few years because, delayed gratification is hard, even though that's the greatest predictor of success, which is interesting in itself for children and beyond. But that's supported by psychological studies. How soon will pleasure occur? And we all think about this differently in proportion to just how much it is that we are given to either favor or not delayed gratification. So some of us really like pleasures that occur very soon, and others are more willing to wait. Certainty. How certain is it that the pleasure will occur? Well, am I taking a chance? Buying a lottery ticket? Okay, well, I have the near-term benefit of thinking that something good might happen, but the certainty is pretty low that I'm going to experience the, giant gain that I'm hoping for. And so, that's of course an example, but that's true for any given thing that we do. Should I talk to a particular woman at the bar? Should someone, run out in the street to save a child that's run out, playing in traffic, that sort of thing. How certain is it that the consequences are going to happen? Fecundity. Fecundity is another one that we're not as familiar with this, but at the same time, we have the word in English. So if something is fecund, then it tends to produce other things. And so this is how much is that pleasure going to produce other pleasures? And so this is kind of a secondary effects sort of thing. So a university degree, of course, you get a degree, you might get a good job, better quality of life around people maybe that are more like you, et cetera, et cetera. And there are all sorts of secondary effects that are going to affect you for a really long time. And so fecundity and duration are huge with that, even though the certainty, depending upon your disposition, and then the propinquity, well, propinquity may seem like it's an eternity away, especially if you're getting a PhD. It always seems like it's, you're staring down a long tunnel. But that's part of that's part of the design there, I think, to make sure that people, make it that are really into it. So nevertheless, so purity, how much is the pleasure mixed with pain? And this is something that, we regularly find, right? There are always pleasures that are sort of mixed in. Well, chocolate cake is great, cookies are great, but at the same time, there's a certain amount of pain that goes along with that as well, in the form of consequences and then also in the form of guilt. And so there are lots of different pieces. All of these things are relevant. And then finally, John Stuart Mill's addition, which is extent. This is the so-called altruistic portion of utilitarianism, where we are told to think of other people and the extent of the effect of our actions upon others. This is both in terms of number and then all of the other variables here: intensity, propinquity, certainty, duration, etc. So anyway, I think that's kind of interesting. Now, the idea of actually applying numbers to these things and trying to create an equation for it, most people have kind of looked askance at that and said, this is probably not going to happen. But at the same time, can we get a general feel for that sort of thing? And is that the way that, is it helpful even in thinking through things? Let's say you have a really hard decision. Would it be helpful then to kind of chart all of these out and say, all right, well, just how fecund is this pleasure? How soon is it to me in temporal proximity and propinquity? How pure is the pleasure? Is it going to be mixed with, all kinds of other pain, either potentially or definitely, et cetera, et cetera? And that might be a useful way of kind of, forcing us to think through all of the individual pieces of this. So there's a possibility there, at least. Now, let's back up a little bit and talk about Bentham and Mill as a child. And so Mill has a very unusual story. He was a kind of experiment. And so he was one who, was raised to be a champion of utilitarianism. So he was from an early age, put with a nursemaid that, spoke Latin and only spoke Latin to the child, that sort of thing. And this is the kind of thing that you hear from people where, instead of pass the salt, it's past the sodium chloride, that kind of thing. So you're trying to constantly up the ante and push the child in an intellectual direction. And Mill said that this put him 25 years ahead of his contemporaries because of his education, because of his upbringing, and so on. But it's also the case that he had a mental breakdown. So he collapsed intellectually at the age of 21, studied romantic poetry for a little while, and by all accounts recovered. But then he chased a married woman for 15 years. And then, none of these stories are clean, right? None of them are just a straight and narrow shot where we can say, yeah, this worked and this is great. It is interesting, though, that they tried this and that there was an experiment in trying to figure out how to raise a child, which if you think about this and you think about when it is that this happened, it wasn't too far after Emile from Rousseau, where he was talking about very much the same kind of thing. And so people were talking about these things. It was right around the time that Jefferson was thinking about these things and figuring out, okay, what should the educational system look like in the United States, and so on. So it was timely for him to be asking these questions, for his parents to be asking these questions, and for this kind of thing to happen to him for better or worse. So anyway, he seemed to turn out okay, at least that he produced some good philosophy, all other things aside. Now, one of the things that Mill said, in addition to extent, is that he recommended a gradation in terms of the different qualities, the different kind of pleasures, in saying that pleasures differed not only in terms of a spectrum with all the different qualities that we mentioned before, but also that they differed in kind, and that there were some pleasures that were just better than others. There were some that were higher pleasures. And so think of poetry and the arts, and then of course philosophy, which that's going to be one of the highest pleasures, right? It's always the case when you ask a philosopher. And historically, right? And Plato said the same thing. Aristotle, what is the best of life? Oh, it turns out to be the contemplative, the philosopher. What a surprise. But nevertheless, so he said that for the higher pleasures, this isn't just saying, all right, well, what the society considers to be higher, we're going to say that that's better and then just kind of leave it at that. No, he does better than this. He says that it's an acquaintance thing. If you are not acquainted with the higher pleasures, then you don't know to desire them. There are certain things that we desire simply by virtue of being animals, by being human. And so our instincts lead us in a direction where we don't have to be told to desire food. You kind of get that, straight away. That's not a big mystery. On the other hand, you might have to, actually curry some kind of desire for I'm trying to think, like jazz or cigars or wine or, philosophy or opera or poetry or any of the things, or coffee, any of the things where when people first try them, it's not necessarily a positive experience. But the thought is, insofar as you are acquainted with them, then you will know to desire them. And this is one of the things that I like to say at this point, is that if you experience a particularly excellent example of something, then you learn to desire it and you're willing to accept ersatz substitutes, which that in itself might be kind of a psychological point that's worth exploring. But at the same time, it's something that's very much what Mill would have to say with respect to the acquaintance of pleasures. I think he would be okay with that kind of thing. Now, the question of happiness. So with both Bentham and Mill, the question is, what are we actually trying to maximize? Is it goodness for the individual? Is it pleasure? Is it happiness? Is it well-being? Is it human flourishing? You see how we're kind of, becoming more and more, um, we're becoming subtler as we go through there. And this may have prompted someone like Nietzsche to say that, only an Englishman would desire happiness, would think that that was the greatest end, that that's not the best. Surely that cannot be the best. And it's not just a question of happiness and contentment, but there is something richer in human experience than simply experiencing pleasure. And that's, I think, one of the nagging things that people frequently think about with this. And it's the same way, by the way, with Aristotle. So when we talk about the Nicomachean Ethics, unfortunately, the word eudaimonia is translated sometimes as happiness. Well, that's not a very good translation of it, because eudaimonia, which means something more like human flourishing is not the same thing as happiness. Happiness seems thin to us in the way that we typically use the word. And so it's almost like something being pretty rather than something being beautiful. Something that's beautiful. We frequently talk about mathematics and, elegance and beauty in the sciences and that sort of thing, but we don't really talk about them being pretty in the same way that we probably wouldn't talk about happiness when we really mean human flourishing. So that's unfortunate. Now, of course, these guys are writing in English, so they didn't have that excuse when they were talking about happiness. So Nietzsche's criticism may land, but at the same time, okay. Now, let's take a look at a couple of the variants of this, how it is that people can conceive of what utilitarianism is, and then we'll go through some of the objections to it. So you're going to hear about act and rule utilitarianism. And act utilitarianism is largely what it is that we've been talking about in terms of, okay, we're going to look on a case-by-case basis and try and weigh things out and figure out, what action is best. Rule utilitarianism is going to distill into certain rules. And the rules ultimately are the kind of thing that will maximize happiness if they are followed over time. So anyway, those are those two bits. Now, the problem, one of the characteristic problems with utilitarianism is that it tends to squash the minority. So you tend towards a situation of tyranny of the majority, which is something that Mill was sensitive to. He knew that this was going to happen. Like, this is a very straightforward thing, right? It's not as though he's going to say, oh, well, I thought about this for 40 years and it never occurred to me. Not the case. So it did occur to him, but utilitarianism does struggle with this because it's difficult to say, well, how much pain can we cause one group in society, and how much are we justified in causing pain to one group in society to help another group? All of a sudden now it sounds like something that's really terribly cruel and maybe characteristic of a lot of human history in terms of, subordinating one population, maybe even the majority of people, so that, another population can live rather well. And that's something that we frequently, okay, well, that feels wrong. We object to that. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem good. And in all the different, means, except for something like Thrasymachus or Machiavelli, then we're probably going to say that's not necessarily all that great. Utilitarianism has trouble with that. It's difficult to deal with it because then you have to try and figure out why it is that you might be able to say that, the minority's suffering is only acceptable to a certain degree. And phrasing it like that, hopefully we'll recall what I said in the beginning about guardrails, that there might be certain conditions where we, kind of have an if-then sort of clause. If we reach this point, then we have to modify the calculus. So that might be one of the potential answers to this with the tyranny of the majority. Nevertheless, it is very much the kind of thing that is a problem. And I think you can probably think of a lot of other historical examples for this, where people are weighing, should we build out the military? Should we have environmental regulation? Should we, build more of this or that, or, whatever it might happen to be, social programs. A lot of things with public policy and debate and, what it is that we do in the political sphere very much points to these concerns, and to what extent we are utilitarians, either intellectually or we should be, insofar as it produces less corrupt outcomes. Those are going to be very relevant and very current sorts of things that are in the practical sphere and are not just, kind of thought experiments that are in the clouds somewhere. So there are a couple of other things which I think are kind of interesting here, and I'll close with this. There's a bizarre story with respect to Jeremy Bentham. And the story is that he had his body mummified and rolled out in a case so that he could still attend faculty meetings at University College in London. And we're told that he was rolled out for a long time and that he was present. He was marked present at the meetings, but present but not voting, which, and is that utilitarian? What in the world prompted that? And is it ego? I don't know. It raises some interesting questions, but at the very least, I think it's kind of a fun and, if not strange, and macabre story for us. So I hope this has provided some food for thought and maybe made utilitarianism look a little bit more interesting than sometimes it's made out to be.